Anyway, keep ancient lands, your storied pomp. Christ was silent. Why is this appropriate in the statute of liberty? Because, you know, what we got in Europe, it's monarchy, monarchy. So here we go. With silent lips, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shores. Send these, the homeless tempest tossed to me. I left my lamp beside the golden door. It's several years later that this is actually, you know, put on the Statue of Liberty, you know, however they do it, embedded, whatever. And she had become such a symbol with this poem for the altruistic, the best motives of what it meant to come to America. Did we always live up to those? Of course not. But it's a good thing to have that kind of goal. And there's, some lines here. If you go to Emma Lazarus, it's the next thing. The New Colossus. And this is a good article. It's lengthy. That's why I included it. I've got a couple lines I want to share with you. As many commentators have noted, the poem is pluralistic in its roots. It is an Italian sonnet composed by a Jewish American woman contrasting an ancient Greek statue with a statue built in modern France. Let's see what else I want to do here. Within this tense climate, talking about U.S.-born descendants and then immigrants, because there's lots of tension there. Within this tense climate, Emma Lazarus, turn the page, a writer and activist from an affluent New York family, had begun volunteering to assist struggling exiles from Tsarist Russia. Oh, interesting. Yeah. And anyway, she starts exploring, along with other writers, this whole idea of, if you go on down, proto-Zionist themes. Lazarus took what proved to be a fruitful approach to public poetry, quietly investing her subject with her personal experience and concerns. One more line I want to share with you, and then we've got to move on, wherever it is. Find it. Not too much. Go to your last page, and that would be 8 of this article, page 8. Go to the last paragraph, the one that begins without a doubt, however. Second line. Got it there? Page 8 of this long article. So, it's right here. Yeah, right there, and going down, right here. Yeah. So, second line. In a way, most poems do not. The New Colossus exists near the border where the ungoverned waters of literature meet the strict land of law. Far out in those waters, language explores what is not literally the case. Closer to land, it asserts what could or should be the case. Crossing onto solid ground, it declares what shall be the case. Again, hopeful. Reaching for a goal. Okay. Even though it's often not realized, still reaching. Third one, let's go. Can I make it yet? O. Henry. How many of you grew up on O. Henry stories? Oh, yeah. I was so surprised. I mean, I've read a few. Oh, my goodness, I had no idea he had written that many stories. He had a lot of time. He spent 5 years in prison to write. So, he had been a banker, and he was accused, either rightly or wrongly, of embezzlement, and he got 5 years. So he wrote. And anyway, if you are on the biography, that's in your second paragraph, second picture, the last line. For him, he was convicted of embezzlement in 1898. He began a 5-year sentenced in federal prison in Columbus, Ohio. So he has a family, and he doesn't live, oh my, can I do this in my head? He's like in his late 40s or something like that. 10. I'm trying. So, yep, that's about right. So he dies of cirrhosis of the liver. So anyway, most famous probably poem, I'm on the poems in my head. Short story he wrote is what?
Yes to the Magi.
Yes. What was the name of that afternoon playhouse that when we were kids was on TV? Is that CBS Afternoon Playhouse? What was that? Do y'all ever remember watching a playhouse in the afternoon, like in the late 60s, early 70s on TV? And it was a dramatic play, short stories. I can't remember the name of it. You were already working it. Okay, never mind. So anyway, I remember seeing Gift of the Magi on that. And that's when I was a teenager. So, you know, he has sustained his reputation pretty well. Most of his stories, and I also gave you that, and that's not all of them. Most of his stories comprise less than 5,000 words. Most of them somewhere in, I don't know, this is a guess, around 2,000. Some of them 1,500, 2,000 words. And if we're in academic world, 1,500 words that's like a 4-page paper. So his stories are short. That means what? For general reading, for public. They're short, to the point. Yeah, I shouldn't say to the point, that's wrong. But they're very readable, accessible. As one of my students said, this reading goes on and on and on. They're not that. So I've given you here the entirety of the Gift of the Magi, and I found one with larger print. My eyes need it too. So anyway, I want to share with you. We were talking earlier. Get hands off the mic. Sorry. Talking earlier about introductions and the hook. Okay, getting you into the story. So let's read together. We'll do these first three. $1.87. That was all. She had put it aside 1 cent, and then another, in her careful buying of meat and other food. Della counted it 3 times, $1.87. And the next day would be Christmas. There was nothing to do but fall on the bed and cry. So Della did it. While the lady of the home is slowly growing quieter, we can look at the home. Furnished rooms at a cost of $8 a week. There is little more to say about it. So you see a comparison between the Dorothy thing, okay? Kind of the severity of their circumstances that they live in, and yet honorable people, carefully saving, not wasting anything. So, yeah. And as you all know, it has such a bittersweet ending. And, you know, as she sells her hair and he sells his watch, I know I just ruined it for you. But anyway, so, spoiler alert. And then they give each other that whole idea of selflessness. Kind of going back to Dorothy's, there's no place like home. There's no place like home. There's no place, there's nothing better than a relationship that's close and sacrificial for one another. So we've still got that going on in this. Let me see what else here. Bob, bless your heart. Sometime in about the next year, you're going to get a copy. So turn the page to page 2. Second paragraph, halfway down. Right after Christmas Day, She had only $1.87 with which to buy Jim a gift. She had put aside as much as she could for months. With this result, $20 a week is not much. Everything had cost more than she had expected. It always happens like that. Many of you can remember, some of you didn't have to go through this. Tim and I can remember we were so poor it was sick. We were married here as college students. We were married here, but we were college students here. We were married. And yeah, we were young, foolish, and that's when you could refund pop bottles. Yeah. And so one of my favorite things to do, or has been in the past, is to sometimes, when it was appropriate, share that little story with students and just to watch their eyes get bigger, like, good night, how poor were you? Well, we were poor, but anyway.
It would have been better if you sold your hair.
So, with all of that, I remember, and I'm sure you got similar circumstances out there, I remember us buying 2 packages of hot dogs that were on sale for 19 cents a package. And that was our meat for the week. And we collected pop bottles out of ditches to get money to buy those 2. And we wouldn't ask our parents for nothing. Because our parents had said, because he was 19, and in Missouri, you know, they had to have parents' permission to get married. So anyway, they said, you can get married, but you remember, you're on your own. We were on our own. So, you know, and I guess one of the reasons I'm telling that is because it teaches you to adapt. You adapt, and you make do with what you've got. And I'm making a little commentary here. Our parents, and I'm not condemning people that are, so don't take it that way. Our parents told us, don't you ever go on welfare. Ever. You make it work. Isn't that interesting? I remember telling my own children that. So guess who got to be their welfare? That's how that works. Anyway, all right, moving along.
You want to read the last paragraph?
Is it the very last? Yeah, I think I had that marked. Hang on. Yeah, I have it marked. Last paragraph. The Magi, as you know, were wise men, wonderfully wise men, who brought gifts to the newborn Christ child. They were first to give Christmas gifts. Being wise, their gifts were doubtless wise ones. And here I've told you the story of 2 children who were not wise. Each sold the most valuable thing he owned in order to buy a gift for the other. But let me speak a last word to the wise of these days. Of all the good gifts, these 2 were the most wise. Of all who give and receive gifts, such as they are the most wise. Everywhere they are the wise ones. They are the Magi. So we still have that story of sacrifice and hope. And, you know, Scarlett, as she's got the carrot up in the air, you know. So, yeah. Tomorrow will be a better day. It will all turn out fine. But even if it doesn't, we're glad we made the sacrifices. That's something pretty special to hang on to. All right, guys. What else do I want to? Say there. We've got the home situation again. And harking back to an earlier quote. Angels of our better nature. You know, they serve each other as angels of a better nature. Other than, what am I going to do? What about me? Oh, you didn't get me Christmas present. What's your problem? You know, and being angry. Whole different mindset of love. All right, let's move it to, I'm going to go next to O Pioneers because it just fits better, regardless of the time frame. So keep flipping. And it may be, it's your very last one, folks. That's the order I put it in. I did Edgar Rice Burroughs before, but there's a reason I'm flipping it. Okay, you're toward the end. Your page should look like this. December, okay? Probably 5 or 6 pages toward the end. How many of you have read at least one of Will Cather's books in your lifetime? Good number. Good. One time. That's right. I'd forgotten that. Good. Okay.
We didn't hear that.
So, one time for RoundUp, the theme was Willa Cather, and so they read. Then you will know, I'm repeating things you already know. She includes in her books, particularly in My Antonia, my brain's doing funny things. In My Antonia, the character Jim is patterned after her own childhood of being raised in Virginia to a certain point and then coming to Nebraska. Oh Pioneers, she was acclaimed for that book really more than My Antonia, which is interesting because as critics look back, I'm not sure this is in there, but as critics look back now on this, that study Cather all the time, and they say, My Antonia, they think is really the better book. Go figure. I do love My Antonia. By the way, was it a Canadian film, Tim? Canadians that did My Antonia that came down to the Stern Museum and filmed part of it there. So, okay, here we've got more. Titus has more. So. And anyway, Stern Museum, go ladies. Oh, you're holding up. I thought you were going to talk to me. Sorry. I'm having senior moments. Quite fascinating from the standpoint that Dr. Elmer Baker, when he was here, taught a Cather class, a 1 hour. And it was a very popular class. And 1 year, just for grants, I wasn't a student at that time, but my husband and I went. And we went to Red Cloud. And since then, we've been to the International Cather Conference, which was in
It was at Smith College in Amherst.
Amherst. Okay. Well, we went there with our daughter, and she was presenting it. So anyway, it is quite fascinating. And the other thing I want to share with you is all of Cather's, if you're not aware of this, University of Nebraska at Lincoln is the repository for all of her papers. Okay? So that's the research center. That is it for Will Cather. Okay? So here we go. What else do I want to share with you? Look at the bottom of the second paragraph. And once again, guys, I could have picked pages upon pages of just biography, and I chose not to because of time. And you guys can look this stuff up on your own if you're that interested. So, the last line there, talking about she explores the stifling effects of small town life on creative young minds. Well, we've got a theme going here through a lot of this. So, whether we decide to call Wizard of Oz a fantasy rite of passage novel, or in the same thing with this, although it's not fantasy, a rite of passage novel, a young girl as far as My Antonia growing up. But if we go to Oh Pioneers, very different. And that's the section that I've given you. Yeah, let's go. As you see, chapter after chapter, go online. Here you go, page by page. That's a good resource, page by page. And all of these are labeled, by the way, chapter 1. That's just the succeeding pages. So here we go. First paragraph. Listen to the descriptors and see if you hear, as we're reading this together, some stylistic similarity between the descriptors and the first as you enter there with Dorothy and the small farm life before the cyclone comes in. One January day, 30 years ago, the little town of Hanover, anchored on a windy Nebraska tableland, was trying not to be blown away. A mist of fine snowflakes was curling and eddying, about the cluster of low, drab buildings huddled on the gray prairie under a gray sky. The dwelling houses were set about haphazard on the tough prairie sod. Some of them looked as if they had been moved in overnight, and others as if they were straying off by themselves, headed straight for the open plain. None of them had any appearance of permanence, and the howling wind blew under them as well as over them. The main street was a deeply rutted road, now frozen hard, which ran from the squat red railway station and the grain elevator at the north end of the town to the lumber yard and the horse pond at the south end. I've got more, but I'll stop there. So my tongue gets twisted around all that assonance and alliteration. Anyway, so skilled writer. What did you notice? It is very dismal. Just within space of about 3 or 4 words mentions gray twice. About this time, you've got the same thing going on with James Joyce. I don't know how many of you have read James Joyce. But anyway, and he writes Araby, another short story. That whole first paragraph, and it's symbolist movement. And when I talk about symbolist movement, what I'm meaning is using a color, a sensory thing, repetition over and over and over again. And it started out in France, and then Americans and British adapted it. So if you pay attention to the sensory and the descriptors, you get a whole different feeling. You're into the story. If you just, read it and go blah, 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 and try to read over that, it doesn't work. It means nothing to you. So, anybody else? Comment? No. Silence. Okay. I don't know. I don't know. I do know, there's a few things I do know on this. I know that she was very attached, even though she did not visit very often in Red Cloud. She still sent money back, and basically saved and restored that little church. She paid for all of the stained glass to be redone and the repairs of the church, which is interesting because she wasn't a particularly religious woman. So I just think that's fascinating. So community was still very important to her.
One year at RoundUp, that was our field trip.
Right. To Red Cloud. Mm-hmm.
And so that was church.
Isn't it neat? Yeah, and it is a small church. Yeah. Since then, what's the guy's name that does the PBS stuff?
Harrison Keeler?
No.
Ken Burns?
Ken Burns. Ken Burns, that does like the baseball series, the Civil War series, PBS. He is now their honorary president or whatever it is of the Red Cloud Cather Foundation, which is a big catch for them. It's a big deal. And so, anyway, with that, he has been able to bring his resources in and people he knows as far as funding for Red Cloud. And so now they've expanded their museum.
Opry.
Yeah.
Opera House is really
They have a couple of bed and breakfasts now that's restored. It's a different trip than it was 10 years ago.
I said Harrison Keeler earlier, but Harrison Keeler did go to Red Cloud at one point, and he engaged in a fundraiser to restore a house.
Really? I didn't know that. Yeah. So, for Nebraska people, Cather, once again, even though she spent the majority of her life living on the East Coast, she kind of a claim to fame as far as authorship here, and particularly with agriculture. So, what else do I want to say here, folks? I'm getting there. Gotta back up. Oh, I'm just barely gonna make it. How many of you have read Old Pioneers? Again? Several, okay, good. Okay, Alexandra. Do you remember Alexandra, the main character, woman? She doesn't marry until late in life, very late. She has a younger brother that she just idolizes. He's gonna be it, the cream of the crop in her family. He's the one she gets all, she's so proud of him, because she's helped raise him. And, you know, she's put her best in him. Well, she also, there's a neighbor girl that he falls in love with. She's married. They have an affair. The husband has a temper. Finds them in the orchard and kills them. Guns them down and kills them. They're found. And why it's such a beautiful story, sad that part, because Emo. Right? And mine, growing up, I had an uncle named, but it was called Emo, not Emo. Anyway, Southern Missouri, Emo. Why it's such a beautiful story is Alexandra, because she knows the neighbor, and she always feels sorry for him. In her anger and rage at this light, she loved both of them. She was very close to the girl. And she was mistreated by her husband. And so she gets over it. So what does she do? She goes and visits him, Frank, in prison. Over and over and over. That spirit of forgiveness and acceptance is one of the reasons it's such an incredibly, it's a novel that just isn't about, you know, the Midwest and farming. It's about the hardships and learning to adapt and learning to go on and to be a quality person, like reflective over there on, you know, the Statue of Liberty, that kind of person. We're going to do a major change here. Let's back up to the next to last one, and let's go to Edgar Rice Burroughs. Because these first four have a real theme that is connected. That I've talked about, not in order there. Sorry, that was my mistake. Edgar Rice Burroughs. What do we know him for? Tarzan of Apes. You know, yeah. And it's interesting because most people, that's what you think of. His first story, though, that really hits it big, and I mean, it did hit it big, and it's kind of interesting on his bio because he wrote and wrote, and he thought, why bother? No one's ever going to read this stuff. How about it? And it finally did. So, let me find what I'm the one, here we go. Lots of pictures of him. Yeah. He actually becomes a, what is it, a Secret Service or FBI agent or something like that. I lost track of it. I was reading too many bios. Anyway, so Tarzan of the Apes comes later. But this first one is what I copied off for you. It was a short story. And what has changed here? We've got four that I've talked about that are very land-driven in the United States. It's about the United States. It's in reality. It's realistic fiction. Well, except the poem. But three of them are realistic fiction. We have a major change. And this goes into fantasy, which is obviously very unrealistic. And he really is kind of known for introducing, as far as mainstream science fiction and making it for everyone. He's also known for comics. Anybody grow up on comics, guys? Edgar Rice Burroughs?
I had a whole
box of them. Cool, cool. So, you know, so what goes along with science fiction and things that are somewhat unrealistic in the storyline Usually we have a what? A superhero. Someone that's bigger than life. Someone that can do things you and I can't do. Okay? They don't, and they have problems presented to them. And usually they're very creative in figuring it out, or it's just their brute strength that takes care of it all. But they don't have the same kind of problems, even though it's fancy, that Dorothy had, or that Alexandra had. You know, pioneers, different problems. Why go there again? Somebody answered it earlier. Why are we changing here? Because we're getting closer and closer. Did you want to say something? No? It's changing, not because of just youth. Today, everything changes because of youth. But it's changing because there's a little bit, there's the adventuresome spirit out and away from the United States. Not everything's so homebound. With Industrial Revolution, with technology, with communication across the pond, all of these things, our worlds are expanding. And so rather than keep revisiting, writers, are always looking for something new, revisiting perhaps material that's already been covered that they think's great. They're not rejecting it necessarily. But they don't know that they can add anything into that, put a different spin on it. So they're always looking for new territory to write. Sir?
But you also have the majority of the people coming from other places coming in that are looking for what they're writing.
Yeah.
And now these people that are growing up have been here looking for what's out there.
Yeah. And one of the cool things about comics too is it's like graphic novels today. How many of your grandchildren, great-grandchildren read graphic novels? Do you read graphic novels? Go ahead. Do you know what I'm talking about? So, graphic novels are just elevated comic books. You know? I don't know if you're familiar with this or not. They now have a third book. I don't have the third book. Art Spiegelman. Mouse, and it's German, M-A-U-S, okay, good pronounce, mouse. Anyway, took World War II and his personal, and his father is a Jew, okay, and took his personal experience growing up with his very damaged, psychologically damaged father and mother. He grows up in the United States, they flee here, and puts it in the form of a graphic novel, a comic book, with balloons. And the Jews are mice, the Poles are cats, okay? And the Germans, Germans. I'm trying to remember. The Germans, I mixed it up, sorry, not cats. The Germans are cats. The Poles are pigs. Sorry if you're of Polish ancestry, but point. Anyway, so why it works is because, every time that I have kids in YA Lit, when I teach young adult literature, and we read this, and he won the Pulitzer Prize for this, by the way. And anyway, every time we read this, I'm like, this is so cool. We had no idea. And that was in 1992 or so that he won that. And so that's when graphic novel takes off in the United States and India. So, it's like the better version of some comics addressing very real issues, not in fantasy. The depiction is fantasy as far as illustrations, but the issues are real life. So, back to the sci-fi. Wanting adventure, wanting something new, going to new lands. Going to new planets. So, Edgar Rice Burroughs has a very, if you look at his bio, very colorful life. It just kind of goes on and on. Anyway, I'm looking here. Second paragraph. He attended half a dozen public and private schools before he finally graduated in 1895 from Michigan Military Academy. Now, he wants to go to West Point in your next paragraph, and they're not going to take him. And so he'd been in trouble, blah, blah, blah. Grades were, moved around too much. He wasn't from the right kind of family. So he goes to this other place trying to think, okay, if I do well here, then I can go to West Point. Well, that never quite works out. Excuse me, go to the paragraph just above this picture. And it says he became a cowboy in Idaho, then a shopkeeper, a railroad policeman, a gold miner, and even an expert accountant, although he knew nothing of the profession. Sounds like great fodder for a writer to me. Someone that's failed at everything, master of nothing, and yet they've got all these ideas and experiences. And so that's what he decides to do with it. Keep going. Let's go over and keep turning pages. I want to go to John Carter. When I was growing up, I didn't hear a lot, and maybe it's just because I just didn't know. I didn't know a lot about Edgar Rice Burroughs. I wasn't into that. I was kind of a little house on the prairie girl kind of thing. And so that was not my thing. It's been interesting to me as I've watched things change and other people mention things that they grew up on and that they read, and then to also see the resurgence on television and movies of the John Carter stories. And so we've got those again. So in our last 5 minutes, here we go, folks. I want to read a little bit of this to you. See? Keep watching for that hero and see what you see in popular movies, fiction, hero worship that we're into today. I'm on the abduction. It says one abduction. Okay, it's after the list. It's on the back. And at the bottom of the page, paragraph. Dawn was just breaking in the eastern Martian sky, and the jungle was dark and still damp with the evening dew. The gloom of the forest made, I guess it's Deja Thoris, thankful for the presence of her companion, who rode in the saddle in front of her. Her hands rested on his broad, bronze shoulders, and the feel of those smooth, supple muscles gave her a little thrill of confidence. One of his hands rested on the jewel-encrusted hilt of his great long sword, and he set his saddle very straight, for he was the mightiest warrior on Mars. Go to the bottom. John Carter turned to gaze at the lovely face of his princess. Frightened, Deja Thoris? Yes. Never when I am with my chieftain. Oh my goodness. I don't think I'm going to survive it. So, skip a couple of lines. Suddenly, Deja Thoris gasped, clutched vainly at John Carter to regain her balance. The mighty throat lurched heavily to the moss. They're on top of this monster thing. To the mossy ground. The riders thank you. I keep wanting to say capitulated. Never mind. Over his head, in an instant, the two had regained their feet, but the throat lay very still. Carter jerked his long sword from its scabbard and motioned Deja Thoris to stay. Okay. Now, some of you wouldn't call this literature. And that's okay. That's okay. What have we got? Don't say Jim. What have we got going on here? What do you see in this? It's adventure. Who's the audience? Who might the audience be?
13-year-old.
Yeah, 13-year-old. Good. Okay. Edgar Rice Burroughs is all about making money. And he's a guy that once he gets the fame, man, and he knows what's going to sell. He gets on that bandwagon. So we see a change here. And this change is not, in my mind, feel free to comment, This change is going to obviously more unrealistic, more the thrill of the moment kind of literature, and not worrying about the deeper issues of life. Okay? Now that doesn't mean that you can't read the whole thing and have a satisfying, a walk in the park experience. It doesn't mean that. What it means is that it starts a trend between, even more so, between higher forms of literature in the United States and more commercial literature. And this is more commercial literature. So if you are related to Edgar Rice Burroughs, or he was your favorite author of all time, forgive me, okay? So, you got a big inheritance from him. So, all I'm saying is that we have tended to be on this trend for some time of more and more and more thrills and adventure. Escapist literature, yeah. And so, which it has its role, it has its function. How does that then, someone considered earlier, why do we need escapist literature? Reality is hard. So if you don't want to face this issue's over here, and if you want to ignore them and just keep doing something else, so you don't have to deal with it. That could be home, it could be global issues, it could be health. You go to this stuff. Okay? So a lack of wanting to face certain things. Now, that's just before we go into we're trying to escape, thinking our lives are kind of terrible. We need these escapes. And then over here in Europe is all this other stuff that we hear about happening. So we do some major changes in our thinking. And the major changes come about when we start receiving our dead boys back home. So, okay, remember there's no television yet, so we don't see those images instantly on TV. We hear about them on the radio. And that's as good as it gets for us as far as news or the people. You've been very attentive. Thank you. Ma'am.
I have a point of trivia. Someone pointed out that the 13-year-old boys like these kinds of things. We can't help but think that Tarzan was a brawny man, and now this, whoever he is a brawny man.
Exactly, yes.
So I was just wondering if the Charles Atlas ads in cartoon, the comic books in the back, had started being printed.
I don't know about that, but boy, don't get me started on the mail thing. So, no, seriously. This escapist type of literature, because we talked about this. We talked about this last semester in novel. My husband and I talked about it. We go through the spy novels, okay, and we start, of course, British and then American, latches on. We go through spy novels, then we end up with what? We end up with James Bond.
Now we can take the escapist novels and just turn them into video games. And you can
That's right.
there.
And then, before long, all of us will be able to afford the total surround, where you put your little dongle things on and you're there. So, kind of scary, isn't it?
Kind of mind-warping.
It's mind warping. Thank you so much. Tomorrow, if you decide that you will endure again, tomorrow we're going to do the world, we're doing more poets, but we're also doing some literature, they're British, literature from the United States. So it's both tomorrow. Okay, thank you all so much.